Welcome to the UW-UX Business and Design Workshop featuring two of our lovely mentors, both Matt and Javan. Do y'all want to do some super quick intros? It's like a short bio. Awesome. Yeah, Matt works as Faire. He is a product designer there, and Javan works for Clio, which is a law software firm startup. So to kick things off, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the Waterloo, Kitchener, and Cambridge campuses of the University of Waterloo are situated on the Haldimand Tract, land that was granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and are within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. So in case y'all aren't super familiar with us yet, we are UW-UX. Welcome to the event. Our goal is to grow the design community and to empower designers to support and inspire each other through community engagements. So we do workshops, mentorship programs, design-a-thons, you name it, we'll try to do it. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest of UW-UX, we have a few of our socials on the corner over here. So in terms of the agenda for today, Matt will be giving our first presentation, which is designing an MVP, and we will have a short 5-minute Q&A afterwards, followed by Javan's presentation, which is business and design metrics. And lastly, we are going to conclude with some UW-UX announcements and upcoming events. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Matt, and please feel free to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Sounds great. Thanks for the intro. Cool. All right. Hi, everybody. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Thumbs up. So today we're going to talk about using design thinking to define your minimum viable product. So we're going to go over a brief overview of what design thinking is, what your problem statement is, and how to form that. Ideating and coming up with different ideas, and then finally how to get your minimum viable prototype out of all that. So there's quite a few steps leading up to it. Before we get started, a little bit about me. I went to University of Waterloo, 2016, English language and literature. Woohoo! It's been quite a few years, but yeah, still a proud warrior. When I was at the university, I founded a startup company called Poet, which I ran for about 3-ish years. Yeah, we had an office in the Accelerator Center, and we were focused on digital signage applications for the winery industry, which was a lot of fun. And then after my startup died a slow, painful death, I moved over to work for a company called Post Media, which has an innovation lab here in Kitchener. I moved over to a startup called Smile.io. Shout out to Joe. And after that, I moved to a company called Faire, where I'm currently a product designer. I am going to keep an eye on the chat. Water. Yes, absolutely. So quick intro to design thinking. You've definitely heard this term a lot, so I apologize if you're already very familiar with this concept. But really what design thinking is a method of problem solving in five easy steps, we'll say. So step number 1 is empathizing with your users or your customers, whoever that might be. Step number 2 is defining the needs of your users. Step number 3 is ideating ideas to come up with solutions that address those needs. Step number 4 is prototyping those different needs. And then step number 5 is testing out those solutions. So today we're going to hop through all of these, starting with the empathize for your with your users. Really what we're trying to figure out at this point in the design process is what are the things that your users say, do, think, and feel. What we're really trying to do is just get to know our users, really. If we have a good idea of who these people are, we can actually solve their problems a little bit better if we can help kind of relate to them. And there's a whole bunch of ways of actually going about doing this. One way is running a survey. I'm actually helping Olya, who's my mentee for this 5-week program, running a survey right now. But it's a great way to reach a really broad audience and get answers to some specific questions that you might have about how they navigate the world today. getting a little bit more granular is running user interviews. So this is actually hopping on a Zoom call, or post-COVID, actually going to someone and meeting them in person and sitting with them for 30 to 60 minutes, asking them lots of questions about how they navigate the world today and how they go about doing living their life, really. Existing studies are another good way of doing this. Depending on what type of idea you have, there's usually lots of industry resources. So you can look at a lot of companies share out this kind of stuff on like LinkedIn quite a lot. But you can look into those studies and see what type of research has already been done in the industry that you're looking at, and help you get a little bit more insight. And then the last is about analytics. So if you work at a company, especially one that has an established product, a lot of times they'll have analytics built in, and you can learn a lot about your customers by looking at the product analytics. Tools like Mixpanel or SQL, if you get really good with SQL, can help you get a little bit of insight into how people actually behave and move through your product. What I'd like to talk about here is actually like how to talk to users. I think it's easy to say, oh yeah, let's go and run a survey or go and interview people, but like how do you actually go about doing that, or finding people to talk to? One way of doing that is looking on social media. There's like a group for basically everything on Facebook. I'm talking to somebody right now who is interested in learning more about the food space and restaurants and how people go about using restaurants in the area. And there's a massive Facebook group called Food in the Waterloo Region, which has like 30,000 people in it. And it's a great way to see exactly, and maybe many of you are actually in that group already, but it's a good way to see kind of what people are talking about in that community. And you can read the comments and things like that. Reddit is another good resource for this. There's a subreddit for basically everything. But you can also look at like keywords or hashtags on Twitter is a good example as well. Just to see kind of what is going on in that community. Another good way of doing this, again, easier before COVID, was industry conferences and events. So there's lots of like, obviously lots of design conferences, but as I mentioned before, when I was working in the winery space, I would actually go to some of these wine conferences and get to talk to people who manage those retail spaces, or are experts in hospitality and wine, and get to really figure out what it is like to like live in their world. Providing a lot of insight there. And then the last kind of step here is just to ask people nicely. One good thing is I assume most of you are University of Waterloo students. And if that's the case, usually people are super receptive if you reach out to them saying, hi, I'm a University of Waterloo student. I love to talk to you because you're an expert in blah, blah, blah field. And people go, oh, a student wants to talk to me because I'm an expert? And they'll actually be, you'd be surprised how inclined people are to actually talk to you. Why are you wine drunk at 10 a.m. User research. I have a fun story for that, but I'll save it till later. So after we kind of do that empathize with our user step, really what we're trying to do is, again, getting to know people. And the next step here is defining our users' needs. And what we're really trying to do at this point is answer the question, how might the life of our users be improved? If they have a headache, how could we get rid of that headache for them? That's give some context to that weird image there of the Advil looking things. But really what we're asking is like, how could the life of these users be improved, and what unmet needs do they have? If they go about the world today doing, living, how do they live the world today, what could be improved in that experience for them? Usually you have an idea that you're asking these types of questions on. So what you're trying to figure out is the gap between how people go about living the world today and what is like the ideal state of that, which kind of gets into our problem statement that we're trying to define here. So this is what I just said, and I actually just stole this one off of Wikipedia because I think it actually summarizes it pretty well. What you're trying to do with a problem statement is craft a sentence that identifies the gap between how people navigate the world today and their desired state of their process or that product. Advil after wine. Lots of good stuff going on in the chat here. But in the example of, sorry, I totally blanked. In the example of like trying to find restaurants, let's say in the area, that's a real big pain point for a lot of people, especially ones maybe that provide food delivery or things like that. So how do people go about doing that today? And what would be the ideal state? What types of things do they find cumbersome about that experience? And you're trying to identify those kind of points. So on the next slide is actually a real life example of a problem statement. And what I'd love is for everybody in the chat to take a guess on what company this actually belongs to. So here's a set of 3 problem statements. And if you have any guesses, please pop it into the chat. So 1, price is an important concern for customers booking travel online. 2, hotels leave you disconnected from the city and its culture. And 3, there's no easy way to book a room without a local or with a local or become a host yourself. See some good guesses here. Hopper, booking.com, hotels, Airbnb. Yeah, was this company called Air Bed and Breakfast, which of course now everybody knows is Airbnb. And yeah, look at that original logo for Airbnb. Ooh, oh my God. But yeah, I think I like the new one a lot better. So, and excuse the grainy quality of the slide here. I think this is actually a screenshot from their original slide deck. So that would have been like over 10 years ago now at this point. So there you go. So now we've gone through, we've empathized with our users, we've tried to define a problem statement or a set of 3-ish problem statements. I always advise people choose at least 1 problem statement, but no more than 3, I would say. If you start bridging more than 3, you kind of cast too wide of a net, and it's actually really hard to solve problems in an effective manner if you're trying to spread yourself too thin. We call it boiling the ocean, trying to solve a whole bunch of problems at once. So the next step is actually the fun part. And I think this is, as designers, I think this is where we really like kind of flexing our craft and leaning in. And but it is really important to do these first 2 steps right, the empathize and the defining the user's needs portions. So we get the most value out of this step, which is ideating for innovative solutions and coming up with cool ways to solve these problems. So for this step, you actually can break it down. There's actually a few different ways that you can approach the ideation step. I like breaking it down into 2 separate parts. Part number 1 is defining what we call a how might we question. And what that does is it takes our problem statement or our set of problem statements and reframes it as a question. So it transforms that into a question. And really what this is prompting us to think of ideas that we could solve with some sort of design. So an example of that, here's one here using our Airbnb example, where on the right-hand side, we have our problem statements, but on the left-hand side are some examples of what a how might we question for each of these might look like. So how might we help travelers find affordable places to stay in destination cities is something that addresses the problem statement of price is an important concern for people. I'm not going to read all of these, but I think you kind of get the gist. Part number 2 is then using those how might we questions to brainstorm lots and lots of ideas. At this point, really what we're trying to do is come up with a large quantity of ideas. This is really done well, I find, if you have a group of people. I've worked at a few different places where you just grab a conference room with some of your design colleagues or product managers or engineers, and you prompt people with a how might we question, and you spend 5-10 minutes writing down as many ideas as you can. Lately, I've been doing this virtually, but of course, this is why we have our handy sticky notes, our Post-it notes. One thing to keep in mind at this point, though, is no idea is bad. The only real rule here is that it has to address the how might we question in some way. So again, we're trying to get as many ideas on the table as we can. The next step after this is then whittling down those ideas. So people can, one common thing that people do is vote on the ideas as a group, or everybody shares the ideas and then you kind of combine them together or layer on top of them, trying to find kind of the best ideas in your group that address that how might we question. Yeah, the group call microphone in the middle. So true. I don't even think anybody knew how to use it. Anywhere I've worked, nobody knows how to use that conference call microphone. Anyway, so after we've come up now with our set of sticky notes, or like, you know, let's say it's a lot of ideas. Let's say we're talking like 20, 30 different ideas at this point. This is where we start prototyping to come up with solutions. And this is really the core, I guess, of my talk here, where we love to talk about how to define a minimum viable prototype out of all of these different ideas. It's a lot easier said than done, but one kind of good guiding principle is to aim for ideas that are low effort but high impact. So what that means is that we're trying to find the ideas that really solve the core issue for our users and really try and address that unmet need that they have, but take a low amount of effort to achieve. I speak to a lot of students and I think, and not just students, everybody actually everybody has an idea for an app or some sort of really cool thing, and it definitely solves a problem that they've identified for some sort of user. The problem with that is that apps or websites, generally speaking, take a long time to build, and they can get quite expensive to do that. So you could spend months building out some sort of application, but while you're spending months doing that, your users are still going with some sort of unmet need. So an example of like a low effort, high impact project I mentioned earlier, an example of like, hey, I want to find restaurants in my area that offer food delivery. Somebody actually did this in Waterloo at the start of the pandemic. I'm not sure if it's live anymore, but they literally bought a domain name called supportwaterlooeats.com, and they put an Airtable table on the site with just a list of all the restaurants in KW that offered food delivery. And super simple to set up, probably took them like an afternoon or an evening. And it definitely met the unmet need. It's like a catchy domain name you can just look up, and then there was a list of all the different restaurants. And it's way easier than going to Google or DoorDash and trying to whittle them through. And I want to support local eateries or restaurants. So it's like a good, simple way of solving a problem that didn't really take a lot of effort. A diagram that kind of, I like this diagram. It looks a little funny, but one thing I love about this is that it illustrates kind of how to go about building a minimum viable product. So let's say that you're talking to your customers and they're saying, oh, I really want a mode of transportation. I need a way to get from point A to point B. Ideally, you would create some sort of like beautiful car that can go really fast. It has like an awesome stereo system, something like, a Tesla or Ferrari or something beautiful. But again, spending time building that kind of thing from the ground up means at no point do your users actually get any value out of it. If you spend the time building, starting with like a wheel, then you build the axle, then you build like the body, and then you finally get to this finished product, at no point in that entire process can people actually get used to it. You can't use a wheel or like an axle on its own. So what this diagram suggests is actually start small and start with something like a skateboard, which again still meets the need, and then layering on top of it in these different like revision cycles. So starting with a skateboard, then eventually you turn into a scooter and a bike and a motorcycle, and then eventually you get to this part where you have your beautiful car. But it means your users have still been able to get value out of whatever service you're providing at every step along the way. Here's another diagram that does a good job of explaining that. John, I can answer that. Tell you what, I'll wait to the end, but I will answer that question first, if that's all right. So another diagram I think does a good job of explaining kind of how to go about this is this diagram here, which is like a pyramid. You could spend, again, months or weeks building out every feature and kind of like a scrappy version of every single feature that you have an idea for. A lot of people, I think this is like a way that people used to go about building MVPs, the minimum viable product, where they would have an idea of like some sort of application and they build out every screen, but kind of like a half-baked kind of version of all that. So the entire app or website would be functional, but like it wouldn't necessarily be fun to use, or maybe had a lot of bugs or something like that. And that was kind of traditionally how companies I've worked for anyway would build a minimum viable prototype. What I like about the one on the right-hand side is it actually suggests focus on one specific core feature that you are going to offer and just get really, really good at that specific thing. You can always layer on and do the other sections of the pyramid at other times, but really focus on making one core aspect of your experience functional, reliable, usable, and actually enjoyable if possible. So we're going to talk back to our friends here at Airbnb. So Airbnb, I think this example here for Airbnb can kind of help demonstrate maybe that pyramid model. Airbnb, the kind of origin story, if you will, the founders had just moved to San Francisco. They were broke, so they were unemployed and were having trouble paying rent. And an event in town had actually booked up all of the hotel rooms. So imagine, like, San Francisco is a pretty big city, so some event had booked up all the hotel rooms. I've read a source that actually suggests it was a design conference, which is kind of funny. Had booked up all the hotel rooms. So any guesses as to what Airbnb's MVP was? I can do this in the chat as well. The answer might surprise you. But again, we're thinking here scrappy, something small that addresses the need of our customer, something that maybe isn't perfect, but it still gets the job done in some sort of way. What is our skateboard if we're an Airbnb? Oh, some of these are really good ideas. Nice. So tent is probably the closest one. But what they did is they rented out an air bed, like an air mattress, in their living room for $80 a night. And provided breakfast in the morning. So that's kind of that enjoyable delight factor that we were talking about at the top of the thing. And that's where Airbnb comes from. I always thought that it was like air, like, oh, we'll help you book a flight somewhere. But no, it's actually airbed and breakfast, which is kind of hilarious when you think about it. The last step kind of this design thinking model here is testing out the solution that you've come up with. And kind of a gotcha here is that there isn't actually a specific step here. It's actually kind of just repeating the whole cycle. So you go back and start off at the beginning where we go and empathize with our users, but now we're kind of asking slightly different questions than we were the first time around. So right now we're trying to dig in to how does our solution that we came up with actually address the needs of our customers, and where could we improve that? And really that's what we're trying to do throughout this entire process, defining where a solution could adapt. Coming up with innovative solutions to layer on top of and iterate on our idea and meet maybe new needs that maybe we've caused by our solution, which is totally possible and totally valid, or a new high priority unmet need that maybe we deprioritized our first go around. And then we do the whole thing. So if you've seen this illustrated in a diagram, it's usually illustrated as kind of like a wheel or like a circle. I like to think of it more like a corkscrew, where at every point in time, you're kind of iterating and layering on top of your product, meaning the product development cycle is never really finished or never really complete. Cool, so that's all I got for everybody. I will take questions. I'm gonna start off with reading the question that was in the chat, which was, would you plan for the skateboard to car analogy early on in the designs, and how would you go about doing that? Before I answer, I'm going to take a drink because I've been talking for 20 minutes. Let a break. So the answer is yes, you would definitely plan for that. This is kind of within a role of like product manager primarily, but as a product designer, it is, I think, important to kind of help form what that path might be. One way of doing this is to get all of your sticky notes together and define what is the ideal state. So really what I like kind of framing it as is like, if we go back to that thing about the skateboard, is like, get all of your sticky notes and all of your ideas together and kind of define what you think your Ferrari or your nice car might be, and then kind of dial it back from there. So think of what your ideal state might be and then dial it back. I think what is important to note is that it's not to say that you're going to hit that Ferrari. The point of doing an iterative design cycle and repeating this like empathy and defining and problem solving and ideation phase along the way is that you are at every point, you give yourself the opportunity to pivot and use the new ideas that you come up with to define your path forward. So what that means is that you're not saying, okay, well, we have to build the car. It's like, well, no, the car is a good idea. And that's, I think, what we're seeing through some of these ideas. But we have to do our checks and balances along the way to make sure we are continuously building the correct thing. If that makes sense. I can take other questions that people have as well. It's kind of like a guide, if you can think about it that way. Sorry, please.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. So we might have a few minutes at the very end. So if anybody has any lasting or firing question, what's the word, like burning questions? Yeah, there we go. Drop them in the chat and we'll address them at the very end. Javan, please feel free to share your screen and start whenever you're ready.
Sounds good. Everybody, can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. You are a, Jesus Christ. That's the last line on that. I have to see this okay? All right, perfect. Cool. Pretty excited to be talking to you folks about business and design metrics. So Matt touched on this just a little bit. One thing he mentioned about making decisions was using analytics. So just gonna jump right in. Quick round of introduction about me. I'm a pretty goofy person overall. Things I like to do, I like outdoorsy activities, hiking, camping especially. I play a good amount of D&D. I'm a dungeon master for a small group of friends, and I'm a pretty aspiring home cook. I like to experiment with different recipes. So enjoying that domestic lifestyle. Outside of that, I consider myself to be reasonably well-traveled. My family moved to Toronto from Beijing when I was just about 10 years old. And since then, I've studied in Waterloo, studied in Seattle, and done a few internships in New York City as well. So like outside of that, these are the places I've actually spent extensive amounts of time living in. But I've also done quite a bit of traveling on the side. So I would say I'm a pretty globalized person in terms of my sphere. So what are business and design metrics? Exactly. One thing that I hear a lot of, like basically before I landed a full-time position, one thing that I always hear whenever I get critiqued is like, what is the impact of your design work? What is the what are the metrics that kind of illustrates how much work that you actually did? What effect your design actually did, right? When I was like doing research on this topic, there's actually surprisingly little amount of content on business and design metrics, how designers can use metrics to promote and illustrate their work. So business metrics specifically, they're numerical or quantitative data that you can use to track and assess the status of a specific business process. So in other words, you can think of it's the number on a progress bar. At the start of the progress bar, you're at 0 state. And at the end of the progress, you want to reach 100% state. That's your ultimate goal. And that metric is where you are on that progress bar. And similarly for design metrics, they are numerical or quantitative data you can use to track and assess the success of a specific design outcome. But they're numbers, basically they're just a progress tracker. Just keep that in mind for now. That's a simpler way of thinking about this. So I'm just gonna jump onto this concentric circle a little bit. This is, as you kind of like gain more design knowledge and design education, you're gonna see this pop up time and time again, but this is the core tenet of user-centered design specifically. What that entails is whenever you're creating a design, you're thinking about things from 3 different perspectives, wearing 3 different hats. Do my users actually want this? So is it desirable? That's a design hat. As a business, should we do this? Will this actually make us money? Is this financially viable? Is there business viability? That's the business hat, the PM hat. And then the third one is, can we feasibly do this with the technology we have today and with the time we have? So of course, building a time machine is great for solving world hunger and preventing a lot of the problems in the world, but we just don't have the technology today. So the most valuable design when it comes to user-centered design is lying in the center. So you may be wondering, why am I covering this right now? That's because design metrics are often business metrics. When recruiters ask you to show metrics on your resume, they're asking for business metrics in addition to design metrics. usability metrics in itself, if it does not have a business impact, are not that useful in isolation. So you may have improved the usability of a page using some sort of system, using some sort of satisfaction. But if, let's say, your company had a paid developer, like a team of 10 developers, 2-3 weeks or 2 months to build out a feature, for you to have like a ambiguous business impact, that salary loss, that salary paid, that's investment gone in without, if you can't articulate what the return on investment on that is, it's not the most successful thing to talk about on your resume and on your portfolio. So why exactly do metrics matter, right? One, first of all, you can use them to better understand and communicate the business value of design. Whenever this is the power of language. If you can speak the same language and use the same vocabulary as your PMs and business leaders, you're going to be able to get a lot more influence whenever you get that seat at the table. You're able to provide a much stronger rationale behind the decisions that you make. So design decisions are made and evaluated using concrete evidence rather than just soft opinions. Instead of like, hey, I think, from my experience, I think since Google did this, we should also do this thing. No, you say, no. Here, our numbers are crap, and we need to do something about these numbers and look at what we did as an experiment before that improved that number by this amount. So you can basically move away from opinion land. And third thing is, it's talking about that little progress tracker, right? Design metrics are one of the best ways to measure progress towards achieving your goal. So it's like, how do you know something that you design or something you launch is successful? Metrics are one of the only ways and one of the best ways of measuring that progress. So here's a bit of an interactive activity. Before we jump into good metrics, we're going to talk about bad metrics first. So I'd like you to input in the chat why you think tracking the success rate of surgeons might be a bad idea. What are the pitfalls with this one specifically? There are no wrong answers here. This was a fun one. I didn't get it when I first saw the slide either. John actually got it absolutely correct. So it could lead to patients with more complicated surgeries from being denied care altogether. Some of the highest paid surgeons in the world are the ones that take on the most risky surgeries. Their overall success rate aren't great, but they're highest paid and they're the experts in their field for this particular reason. So why I'm kind of bringing this up is because metrics can easily be manipulated, leading to unintended results. If you're measuring the wrong thing, if you're setting the wrong metric, it may lead you down the wrong path and create perverse incentives. So every metric should connect to a story to be both relevant and useful. We'll come back to this one in a bit. So you may be wondering, how do I actually create these effective metrics, right? The way I like to approach metrics is, as Matt kind of mentioned earlier, you always want to define the user problem first. Once you have a better understanding of the problem, you can then kind of, once you have like the zero on that progress bar, your goal will be at like what your 100% state would be. After you have the 0 and the 100, you kind of have a vision of where you're going, you have a soft direction, you can generate a way of measuring success towards that goal. So if you're saying, hey, my lemonade stand is not doing so well, we want it to be more successful, we want it to make, let's say, $1,000 a month, how much money you're generating per month, that's your metrics that you're measuring for tracking towards that goal. So understanding this one a little bit, good metrics are easily understandable. You're able to remember them, understand them, and discuss them and debate them with other people. You can share them easily. 2, they're comparable. You can compare it to other time periods, user groups, and other competitors. 3, these are things that are actionable. So they can illustrate what action one has to do in order to affect this metric in terms of basically saying like, hey, if we want to go from like 0 to 100, what do we need to do to make sure we're moving closer to that 100% goal? And the 4th thing is it needs to be contextual. It should appropriately measure the desired outcome without causing any unintended consequences. So I'll give you another interactive example here. So we'll talk about pretend like we have a user problem. So there are Instagram influencers and there are Instagram sponsors. So let's say if a Instagram sponsor wants to pay their influencer a certain amount of money, but right now the influencers, it's not guaranteed that they'll get their money because they will need to just rely on the word of the sponsor, and two, they need to input their information on another payment system. So there may be the issue of like, let's say if you're a Canadian Instagram influencer and your sponsor is from Germany, maybe there's currency issues involved. Maybe there's identity issues, verification issues involved. Maybe they're just a scummy sponsor. They don't decide to pay you. So what does Instagram's team want to do? They want sponsors to be able to pay influencers directly within the app. Cut out the middleman, cut out the transaction system. So here's the interactive pieces. What do you think might be a good metric to measure success towards that goal, to track how successful this feature is? No wrong answers here. Both of them are good, but the one, this is actually a problem that's similar to something my company has been attempting to solve. The one that we decided on is basically payment processing volume from sponsors to influencers reaching a certain amount. So in other words, total amount exchange from all sponsors. It's basically it's a net. The reason, okay, you know what? I need to go back to my own slide here. This is not particularly understandable. Total amount exchange from sponsors too. I'm just going to change this right here. Oh, whoops, sorry. Wait. That's actually, I like that phrasing a lot more. Yeah, so total amount exchange from sponsors to influencers in total. So the reason for this, why just measuring like raw quantity of influencers and sponsor pairs may not be the best idea, is because some sponsors may only want to sponsor 1 to 2 influencers, but pay them a lot of money to do a lot of advertising. So some sponsors may want to do like a quality over quantity approach. Other sponsors may want to do a quantity over quality approach. So because of those two varying strategies, you don't want to punish the ones that are only investing in a few specific strategic influencers. So why total amount is good? Because it kind of incorporates both people that are for sponsors that are both looking for a few influencers and for sponsors that are looking for a lot of influencers. So you may be wondering now, good question, great question. I'll come back to it later. So how exactly do I collect these metrics now? The easiest way to approach this are just with user satisfaction forms with feedback forms. So use survey forms, leverage Google Forms. This is a good example of it. It's a customer satisfaction survey. How satisfied were you with this experience? A scale of 1 to 5. But the most important thing is, remember what I said earlier about metrics need to be contextual. It's very, very important that you ask them to elaborate on their answer, because with just a singular sentiment, a singular score of 1 to 5, it's very, very difficult to understand the rationale for why someone may feel that way. But if you can attach a rationale associated with that feeling, it makes it a lot more useful. An example of this is Patagonia. They actually have this form just on their website for collecting user feedback. So here it says, like, what do you think of this, right? You can share what exactly you want to, you can share your feedback directly, or you can input your email. a lot of actually people in the industry use this specific type of form to collect feedback. Another one that you can use is this thing called a system usability score. So my company likes to call it SUS. So what this actually is a questionnaire of 10 questions where you ask the users to write anywhere from strongly disagree up until strongly agree. So again, it's a sentiment from 1 to 5. And there is a calculator that you can basically punch in for after they fill out this form, it generates a usability score that's associated with it. This one has a lot of nuance to it. So if you're interested in using this one in your usability testing and usability studies, I highly recommend you looking this up because this is a lot of content and there's not enough time in this talk itself to go over everything and be exhaustive. Here's an example of when I used the system usability scale at work. So I gave them like a list of questions in terms of what this interface is. This is called maze.design. But essentially here, as you can see from this one, this is not the best one, but it's all right. Its average is hovering around 1 to 2. So in terms of things that are a bit harder to collect though, in terms of analytics, definitely leverage analytics and ask what your PM and developers have already implemented to track the data. Typically, most companies, most PMs that's worth their salt, they've already had some way of tracking this data there. Ask them what they have, ask them to pull out their dashboards, ask them what you can use to build that influence, to generate those metrics. A good example of it is like Hotjar, for example. Hotjar is a paid service, but what this thing does is you can use it to detect heat map in terms of mouse cursor movement, cursor clicks, where people are clicking on the most, as well as where people are scrolling on any given page. This is a paid service, so but they do have a free trial, but this is something you could look into that's more complex in terms of analytics. So here's another simpler example of what I used at work previously. So this is total number of support tickets, aka complaints or questions that were filed by users. You're wondering like, how exactly is this a design or business metric? The reason is because support tickets, your support team, they don't get enough love. And for every time that there's a issue where there's a question from a user, it indicates some sort of user pain. So when one metric that is often looked like that's kind of like underrated is if you can reduce the amount of user support tickets coming in to bother your support team by a set amount, that's a huge amount of success because it frees up company resources for those support team members to help on other more important tasks. So this is one really easy way of just saying like, hey, you know what, before this redesign, support was getting like 100 tickets a day. But after this redesign, the support team is only getting 20. Like that's an 80% reduction in volume, ticket volume. That's huge for the company. You're saving a lot of money there. Here is a more complex version of a dashboard that I use on my day-to-day basis. This is there are many different softwares for doing this. Matt, I think he mentioned a different tool, but my company has been using this tool called Looker quite a bit, where we separate users in terms of categories. So depending on how many people are in a certain organization, they have different behaviors, and we kind of classify and classify these users more differently. But that brings it to the end of the presentation. Happy to take any questions. I'm just going to go over some of the ones in the chat for now, but feel free to pop other questions in. Yeah, John, that's exactly right. So in 95% of the cases, if you're allowing your users to pay other users, the Instagram will just want to cut. It's more about the net volume that matters and less so much about how many people are actually using it. Mac, unfortunately, this deck is specifically tailored for quantitative data. For qualitative data, that would be a different conversation. But methodology for synthesizing storytelling and behavioral data, I don't have the best answer for that. Maybe someone else could help out here.
I can give this one a go. I'm about to try this, so one tool that I found is using a tool called Green, where you can upload recordings of Zoom calls or that you have with interview participants, and it'll transcribe your entire voice recording, allow you to search that recording, and then create little small, like short video clips, like 30, 45 seconds. I want to make sure that I'm answering the question correctly. But anyways, what I'm going to be doing with that is assembling essentially yeah, thank you, that's the link, correct. Is assembling a Notion doc that has pulled out insights from all these different like user interviews that I've been doing. And I'm going to embed the Green videos in there so I can attach real people saying things to the insight that I've pulled out with a little bit of supporting context. Could definitely throw a graph in there as well. I think the combination of qualitative and quantitative data, I think, is really just super powerful. I don't know. I'm going to look up. What do you mean by grounded analysis?
Yeah, one time I was facilitating a user research session, and then the guy at the end, he was like, "Is this grounded analysis, or how do you analyze it?" And I had no idea what it meant, but apparently it's when you get like a transcript of your interviews, and you do that for like each, and you find the themes, or you
okay.
kind of like delve into each of the transcripts to find things that are in common.
That's definitely a more scientific kind of method of doing it. What I do, I spoke to our head of research about this as well, because I wasn't sure if I was doing my synthesis correctly. And what he said was, at the end of every call, go through like the raw interview notes and just like kind of highlight things that stand out. And then after a while, after you've done, a handful of calls, you can start to see, which things are highlighted in every single conversation. It's definitely, I think the grounded analysis way is probably a way more methodical and scientific way of doing it.
Perhaps. I think the interviewee was he had his PhD, so that makes sense. Yeah, so any more questions for Javan? That was a really interesting presentation. So in terms of people kind of beginning their design careers, would the most accessible way for them to get metrics be with the SUS?
Yeah, either SUS or some form of user satisfaction with feedback form. Especially, yeah, it's nice to know how to set up these analytics, but most companies don't expect you to know this stuff at all. If you know it, it's a nice bonus, but you're typically not paid for it. But yeah, the system usability score is a good way of evaluating things. And customer satisfaction survey. These are simple, these are rudimentary. You can apply it for a lot of different things. And the powerful thing is with this feedback form specifically, you can glean a lot of qualitative data as well. So.
I see. Thanks a lot. Does anybody else have? Okay, perfect. John has a question.
Yeah, so the challenge there is, like I said, typically, like if it's not something that will have actual business impact, it is a bit more difficult to generate metrics from. If you're speaking about hypothetical metric, what form does the product or feature live as? Is it a website or is it just more conceptual piece? If it's a conceptual piece, what you can do is you can generate some, you can still use it to gather customers. You can still use one of these like user satisfactions things to generate user sentiment. What you can do is this thing, not the best at explaining this one. So there is this thing called a sentiment analysis. What you can do is gather a whole bunch of customer insights all together and then just kind of pick out keywords. Before you did the redesign or before the design, what is the overarching sentiment around that? And then and then after you do the thing, you collect this same piece of data again and kind of evaluate and gauge what the sentiment is afterwards to see whether or not there's a positive trend or a negative trend for how that redesign might have affected the overall sentiment towards that feature or product that you designed. So if you see a lot of if you see a lot of positive words for the post redesign, then that's probably means the sentiment is trending in the right way. This is another way that you could use qualitative data to kind of transform it into quantitative data, but it might be a bit more difficult to sort of advocate for that type of practice within a company where there's like better ways of tracking data available. Oh, thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen now to go over some ending announcements. But again, thank you so much to both of our speakers. Those were awesome presentations, super insightful. And I think it was really helpful for us to have those kind of like applicable things like the SUS and also how we can best evaluate our own MVPs. So let's all give a little round of applause to our amazing speakers. Awesome. All the little Zoom claps. Yes. So what I'm going to do now, again, share my screen. Does that look okay to everyone? Perfect. So some announcements to wrap everything up. For mentorship, we have a couple more events coming up for this term. The first of which is our mentorship AMA or mentor AMA. We're going to have some lovely mentors yet again come back and tell us a little bit more about their experience. So now you can dump all your questions. So what's it like in industry? How do I get a job? How do I create a good portfolio? So come out with all of your questions and I'm sure we'd all love to discuss. Another event that we have is Standing Out as an Applicant workshop, and that's the following week, July 28th at 8 p.m. ETD. And we will have our announcements with more details coming out in the mentorship channel soon in Slack, so keep your eyes peeled on those as well as for the Zoom invites. And in terms of general UW-UX events, we have our Indent 2.0, and this time it is a panel on DEI and accessibility. This is taking place right after our Standing Out as an Applicant workshop on July 29th and July 30th. So I really highly recommend attending this one in addition to the mentorship events. So the mentorship events are only exclusive to people who are within the mentorship program, but this is open to anyone, people at Waterloo, people across the world. Last year we had a really great turnout for this, and this year we have some speakers from NerdWallet and a few other really cool companies, and they're going to be talking more about how we can be more inclusive and accessible as designers, as well as teaching design. And last but not least, we also have a Pathways to User Research event on July 21st. So that is the week before Indent, the same week as the Mentor AMA at 8 p.m. Eastern Time again. And this event is really awesome if you're interested in user research, but not quite sure where to start. We're going to have panelists come in who work in the user research industry and tell us a little bit more about their experience. So be sure to follow our social media to stay up to date with everything. Carmen's just dropped the Instagram and Facebook links in the chat. And with that, we now conclude our event. And here I put in the lovely graphic for our research panel. Yes, with a preview of some of our panelists. So a little sneak peek for y'all. We see some Loblaws, eBay, Shopify. And with that, thank you so much for coming, everyone. It was an awesome time, and we hope to see you again at our following events.